Abstract Expressionism is a post-World War II art movement in American painting, developed in New York in the 1940s. It was the first specifically American movement to achieve international influence and put New York City at the center of the Western art world, a role formerly filled by Paris. Although the term abstract expressionism was first applied to American art in 1946 by the art critic Robert Coates, it had been first used in Germany in 1919 in the magazine Der Sturm, regarding German Expressionism. In the United States, Alfred Barr was the first to use this term in 1929 in relation to works by Wassily Kandinsky. Style technically, an important predecessor is Surrealism, with its emphasis on spontaneous, automatic, or subconscious creation. Jackson Pollock's dripping paint onto a canvas laid on the floor is a technique that has its roots in the work of André Masson, Max Ernst, and David Alfaro Siqueiros. The newer research tends to put the exile surrealist Wolfgang Paulin in the position of the artist and theoretician who fostered the theory of the viewer-dependent possibility space through his paintings and his magazine Den. Paulin considered ideas of quantum mechanics, as well as idiosyncratic interpretations of the totemic vision and the spatial structure of native Indian painting from British Columbia, and prepared the ground for the new spatial vision of the young American abstracts. His long essay Totem Art, 1943, had considerable influence on such artists as Martha Graham, Isamu Noguchi, Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko and Barnett Newman. Around 1944, Barnett Newman tried to explain America's newest art movement and included a list of the men in the new movement. Paulin is mentioned twice. Other artists mentioned are Gottlieb, Rothko, Pollock, Hoffman, Basiotes, Gorky and others. Motherwell is mentioned with a question mark. Another important early manifestation of what came to be abstract expressionism is the work of American Northwest artist Mark Tobey, especially his white writing canvases, which, though generally not large in scale, anticipate the all-over look of Pollock's strip paintings. The movement's name is derived from the combination of the emotional intensity and self-denial of the German Expressionists with the anti-figurative aesthetic of the European abstract schools such as Futurism, the Bauhaus, and synthetic Cubism. Additionally, it has an image of being rebellious, anarchic, highly idiosyncratic and, some feel, nihilistic. In practice, the term is applied to any number of artists working, mostly, in New York who had quite different styles, and even to work that is neither especially abstract nor expressionist. California abstract expressionist J. Moyser, who typically painted in the non-objective style, wrote about his painting Mare Nostrum: "It is far better to capture the glorious spirit of the sea than to paint all of its tiny ripples." Pollock's energetic action paintings, with their busy feel, are different, both technically and aesthetically, from the violent and grotesque women series of Willem de Kooning's figurative paintings and the rectangles of color in Mark Rothko's color field paintings, which are not what would usually be called expressionist, and which Rothko denied were abstract. Yet all four artists are classified as abstract expressionists. Abstract expressionism has many stylistic similarities to the Russian artists of the early 20th century such as Wassily Kandinsky. Although it is true that spontaneity or the impression of spontaneity characterized many of the abstract expressionists' works, most of these paintings involved careful planning, especially since their large size demanded it. With artists such as Paul Klee, Wassily Kandinsky, Emma Kunz, and later Ron Rothko, Barnett Newman, and Agnes Martin, abstract art clearly implied expression of ideas concerning the spiritual, the unconscious, and the mind. Why this style gained mainstream acceptance in the 1950s is a matter of debate. American social realism had been the mainstream in the 1930s. It had been influenced not only by the Great Depression, but also by the moralists of Mexico such as David Alfaro Siqueiros and Diego Rivera. The political climate after World War II did not long tolerate the social protest of these painters. Abstract Expressionism arose during World War II and began to be showcased during the early 40s at galleries in New York such as the Art of this Century Gallery. The McCarthy era after World War II was a time of artistic censorship in the United States, but if the subject matter were totally abstract then it would be seen as apolitical, and therefore safe. Or if the art was political, the message was largely for the insiders. While the movement is closely associated with painting, and painters such as Arshile Gorky, Franz Klein, Clyfford Still, Hans Hofmann, Willem de Kooning, Jackson Pollock, and others, collagist Ryan and sculpture and certain sculptors in particular were also integral to abstract expressionism. David Smith, and his wife Dorothy Dinner, Herbert Ferber, Isamu Noguchi, Ibram Lasaw, Theodore Roshak, Philip Pavia, Mary Callery, Richard Stankiewicz, Louise Bourgeois, and Louise Nevelson in particular were some of the sculptors considered as being important members of the movement. In addition, the artists David Hare, John Chamberlain, James Rosati, Mark di Suvero, and sculptors Richard Lippold, Herbert Ferber, Raoul Haig, George Rickey, Reuben Nakian, and even Tony Smith, Seymour Lipton, Joseph Cornell, and several others were integral parts of the abstract expressionist movement. Many of the sculptors listed participated in the 9th Street Show, a famous exhibition curated by Leo Costelli on East 9th Street in New York City in 1951. Besides the painters and sculptors of the period, the New York School of Abstract Expressionism also generated a number of supportive poets, including Frank O'Hara, and photographers such as Aaron Siskind and Fred Mcjara, whose book The Artist's World in Pictures documented the New York School during the 1950s, and filmmakers, notably Robert Frank, as well. Although the abstract expressionist school spread quickly throughout the United States, the major centers of this style were New York City and the San Francisco Bay Area of California. Abstract Expressionism and the Cold War. Since the mid-1970s, it has been argued by revisionist historians that the style attracted the attention, in the early 1950s, of the CIA, who saw it as representative of the USA as a haven of free thought and free markets, as well as a challenge to both the socialist realist styles prevalent in communist nations and the dominance of the European art markets. The book by Francis Skinner Saunders, 49, The Cultural Cold War, The CIA and the World of Arts and Letters, published in the UK as Who Paid the Piper? CIA and the Cultural Cold War, details how the CIA financed and organized the promotion of American abstract expressionists as part of cultural imperialism via the Congress for Cultural Freedom from 1950 to 1967. Notably, Robert Motherwell's series Elegy to the Spanish Republic addressed some of those political issues. Tom Braden, founding chief of the CIA's International Organizations Division, IAD, and ex-executive secretary of the Museum of Modern Art, said in an interview, "I think it was the most important division that the agency had, and I think that it played an enormous role in the Cold War." Against this revisionist tradition, an essay by Michael Kimmelman, chief art critic of the New York Times, called Revisiting the Revisionists, the Modern, its critics and the Cold War, argues that much of this information, as well as the revisionists' interpretation of it, concerning what was happening on the American art scene during the 1940s and 50s is flatly false, or at best, contrary to the revisionists' avowed historiographic principles, decontextualized. Other books on the subject include Art in the Cold War by Christine Lindy, which also describes the art of the Soviet Union at the same time, and Pollock and After, edited by Francis Frasina, which reprinted the Kimmelman article.